So thanks everyone for coming to the first of our Historic Boulder sponsored presentations in honor of Preservation Month, which is May. We'll have a presentation at 7 o'clock each Wednesday, starting tonight and the next 2 Wednesdays. The next Wednesday will be a presentation about Fort Chambers in Boulder, and the week after that will be Dan Corson presenting about early African-American residents of Boulder and where they lived and when. So tonight, though, we're pleased to have the opportunity to hear Len Segel talk to us about modernism and its effects on Boulder over the years. I've had the distinct pleasure of hearing Len speak on this subject once before at a Boulder, historic Boulder event that was at BMOCA. It was one of the more interesting presentations I've heard on historic preservation of any kind, anywhere. So I'm really excited that we're all going to get to hear Len this evening. Len is, many of you probably know Len. I mean, he is the foremost expert, I think it's fair to say, of modernism in Boulder, and is also regionally and nationally known in the modernism movement. And I can't be more excited to have him present to us this evening. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton to Len and let you educate us. Thanks again, Len, very much for your sharing your evening with us.
My pleasure. And I'm just going to do the technicalities here of taking over the screen and turning on the presentation. Let's see. Are you seeing that screen again? Modern architecture shapes the progressive spirit of Boulder.
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, so I feel like I'm preaching to the choir tonight. I think all of you collectively know so much about Boulder, but I hope that the story that I'm going to weave tonight is going to tell you why it's important to understand the concepts of modern architecture and how that's influenced making Boulder and Boulder County the innovative place that is recognized worldwide. And I have quite a bit to show, and I'm probably going to show too much. Rather than diving deeply, I'm going to kind of go across the surface a little bit. I look forward to your questions and comments, and please use the chat box if you want to remember questions while they come up. Just put them in there and we'll get to them after the end. And so I'm going to jump into it. That's Winston Churchill, and we all know this the saying, we shape our buildings or after they shape us. And that's really the heart of this presentation tonight, that the buildings in Boulder have helped to shape who we are as progressive people, and creating a progressive community. And just to set the table for you, who am I and why do I think I have anything to say about this subject? So I'll get to that, but I've kind of got 6 chapters or 6 storylines to tell tonight. And so it'll be a little bit about me, and then talking about Boulder's progressive karma, what the modern movement is, who the pioneers in Boulder have been, and then how that has shown up in different types of architecture in Boulder. And then certainly I'll focus on some of the hot modern preservation issues that are facing us right now. So just a little bit about me. I'm an architect. I've been working as an architect for 40 years, over 40 years. And I work leading a design studio at Kephart Architecture in Denver. We're about 65 people who do a focus on residential architecture. And we've done architecture in Boulder, and we do architecture all across the country. And so that's a little bit about Kephart. this is my home. It's in Mapleton Hill. I've lived here in Boulder since '89, and in this home since 1990. And we popped to top, went through the landmarks approvals process, and I've raised daughters here, and it's just been a great location for us to be. I've also designed buildings over the years, and just some of the buildings that I've been involved with. And architecture is a team sport, so I can't ever say that I did it all. It was a team effort. The top left is Fraser Meadows, and the renovations and additions to that mid-century modern building were an interesting challenge and a great one, a wonderful client. Top right is the Xilinx headquarters. So Xilinx was originally a Boulder technology community and just outgrew the town, so needed more space. And there's 125,000 square feet there that we designed. Bottom right is the Atlas Institute on the CU campus, and it's a computer and technology and arts think tank, more or less. The bottom left is public utility, IREA, in Sedalia, Colorado, and they wanted to express their futuristic outlook on their work in a kind of a new look for their campus, their building. And in the middle is a brand new senior living building. So you would look at that and not think that's senior living, because senior living is gables and old, kind of an old look. But the new looking to the future, the people looking to the future are looking to do something more fresh, and that's modernist. The next section I'm going to focus on is the different aspects of Boulder, that are super progressive. And, we've seen these quotes and the accolades of Boulder over the years. I know when since I've moved here, New York Times wrote about 25 square miles surrounded by reality, which was in some ways a put down, but in many ways, I think we revel in that. And then the last quote is, "That's so Boulder," and I love that expression, because we are this unique place that is thinking outside the box, and we are expected to do that. And so I just wanted to summarize kind of this next series of images, starting with this kind of collage of pictures of health, the health world. In the top left image is the sanitarium up on Mapleton Hill. That was all about health food and healthy lives, and helping people get cured from tuberculosis. And then we had, hippies developing soy products. Steve Demos, who became a tycoon in the soy foods. And then another hippie, Mo Segel, no relation to me, although maybe he's a distant cousin, gathering herbs in the foothills and turning them into the celestial seasonings. And then the alfalfas, which was one of the earliest health food chains. Those are the founders of that. And then the Carnival Cafe from the hippie days of Boulder, where there were happenings that were not only about food, but it was lifestyle. And speaking of lifestyle, fitness has been a hugely important aspect of Boulder's history, all the way from the time when people would hike up to the Royal Arch in dresses and heels. And then you've got kind of the royalty of athleticism in Boulder that trickles down to all of us. You've got Connie Carpenter and David Spinney and Frank Shorter and Jenny Simpson, and a shameless plug for my wife and sister-in-law, the Pilates Center. So when you think about alternative types of fitness, Pilates and different forms of yoga have really been fostered and carried on in Boulder like no other place. And that's part and parcel of that innovative thinking about healthfulness. Of course, we have a major university and an alternative university with CU and Naropa, and that whole educational heightening spins off into our public school systems, which are almost always thought as the best in the state. And so we have thought leaders at these universities who contribute to the PTOs of these schools throughout Boulder County. And it just raises the bar for the quality of education and innovative thinking. And I purposely put that picture of the CU Engineering Center because it's not the backward-looking building style, but it was a forward-looking building style when CU was wanting to express that they were a more of a progressive college. Culture. So culture, we have a very progressive culture, starting all the way back with Chautauqua on that top left image, with Texas school teachers coming here to cool off in the cool summers of Colorado and educate and spread the word about knowledge and far-reaching thinking. I grew up near the original Chautauqua Lake in New York State. So that whole movement carried all the way across the country as tent cities. But Boulder, like very few other Chautauquas, continued it, as we all know, which just shows that Boulder was so unique to create this fertile place that a tent town could get roots and kind of have brick and mortar and get established. And then the bandshell, it's, you know, just a free-spirited place for all sorts of discourse to happen, from culture to protests and everything in between. The building on the bottom right is a mid-century modern work of architecture that was a Masonic lodge that's been converted into the Museum of Boulder. And it's just a terrific showcase of all these innovations that I'm kind of speaking about tonight. And then there was a period of time when vaudeville was a wave across the country, and Boulder, of course, had its own vaudevillian theater, the Boulder Theater, and it thrives and is alive to this day, still bringing those, you know, 21st century vaudevillians and bringing the latest ideas in music and presentations. So we go from culture to counterculture. So I don't want to oversell the hippie influence in town, but it definitely had its moment, and I'd say continues to populate the thinking of the baby boomers, who are pretty heavily populated here in Boulder. So of course you get the free love, free dancing, free-spirited people. But the next image in the top middle are protests. These are the people circling Rocky Flats to try to get that place closed. And those protests eventually wore the government down, along with the changing of the sensibility of nuclear deterrence. And so that's a big aspect of counterculture. And then Boulder, you know, in the right picture, is just a hotbed of openness toward thinking about gender equalities for all people, LGBT, and it's just a great place for that to be. We were in the forefront of that. The bottom middle image is protests on campus. Every campus has protests. We have our fair share of those, and those are part and parcel of making Boulder a more enlightened and activist community. And then the bottom left, you know, I had to put it in, that's one of those 420 gatherings on the CU campus that changed Boulder and the state in the same way that the Prohibition movement changed Colorado, and then throwing over the Prohibition movement changed Colorado. And so we're still coming to terms with that, but Boulder has been important in that, and Colorado certainly has been in the forefront of opening up that aspect of counterculture. Another big aspect, and you still see this around town, is exploration of spirituality and religion. The top left image is Star House, and it's one of many different alternative establishments, communes, whatever you want to call it, that populated the foothills around Boulder. And to this day, they're still drawing people from all over the country to take retreats at these places, kind of like an Esalen or an Est kind of experience. We have a large population of Buddhists in the Shambhala Center as a spin-off of Naropa, or Naropa is a spinoff of this community. There's a yoga center in El Dorado Springs using a geodesic dome for their main building. And the bottom left image is the Friends Meeting House from the early 70s. It was one of those Charles Hartling buildings, and I'll get to that Charles Hartling guy later on. So next chapter about that progressive spirit of Boulder is science. And I learned something very recently, that it was Harry Truman who decided that it wasn't safe to have all of our think tanks of science gathered in Washington, D.C. And so he decided it would be great to move them out. And Eisenhower was the one who knew Colorado and knew Boulder and said this would be a great place for the Bureau of Standards, the atomic clock, and the advances that those scientists have been developing over the years. And then the top right image is just a symbol of the whole microbiology movement that has developed in the sciences at the university and spun off. And the image below, which is not the 4 Beatles crossing Abbey Road, but it's 4 Nobel Prize winners who teach or have taught at CU or have worked in the laboratories around CU. And it's amazing that a place as small as Boulder and a university as small as we are, kind of, in the boondocks, in the scheme of things, has developed this thriving interest and innovation in microbiology. Even, you just read in the paper yesterday or the day before about CRISPR technology and how that's Boulder's been involved with helping to shape the science to develop the vaccine for COVID. And of course, we have our own Scott Carpenter, one of the first 7 astronauts, American astronauts. And if you look closely, his capsule is called Aurora 7. And Aurora is the name of the street that he grew up in Boulder. So there's this legacy of science, space exploration, and astrophysics here at the university and in Boulder. Another thing that we should be proud of is the innovations from the very earliest days to today about government planning. Way back when, we decided to buy the Flatirons and protect them as a backdrop forever to this town and not let them get developed, and to use them to kind of replenish our spirits. And then the image on the top right is a little small, but it's basically all that green is our open space that wraps around the city. I think it's 43,000 acres of open space. And along the left edge is the blue line. And the blue line is that legislation that passed to not allow any development above a certain elevation to protect that backdrop of Boulder. And then finally, that's an early image of Pearl Street Mall shortly after it was completed. Lawns and places where people could hang out. It's evolved over time, but it's one of the only original pedestrian malls that has lived on. I know Louisville, interesting recently, has closed its main street, and who knows, maybe it will become a permanent pedestrian street in the same way that Pearl Street has. But it just shows that the people in Boulder really embraced it. It's innovative, and we worked hard to keep it successful. You can't talk about innovation without talking about computer technology and other high technologies. The top left image is IBM, the IBM headquarters in Gun Barrel. And that architecture was actually derivative of the IBM buildings that were designed on the East Coast by Marcel Breuer, an architect whose firm I worked for in New York City. But the spin-offs from IBM include Storage Tech on the top right, and then it just fostered just an avalanche of other newer technology companies like Zayo in the bottom right and Google in the bottom left, and it continues, through the tech center in Louisville and out to Broomfield and all the way around us. That technology continues to grow. So this is just kind of a wrap up of this, what I'll call the first chapter of my presentation. And it just, Boulder's a progressive place, and there's, at least 9 different areas that I outlined that are progressive. And I'm going to come back to these later to show you kind of the architecture that supported that. But I want to get to, well, what is modernism, and why does modernism, support innovation and progressive ideas? And so this is just kind of a wordy page, but I'm going to get to more pictures afterward. But this is an important part of the presentation, because it talks about the precepts of the modern movement of design. And the modern movement of design wasn't only an architectural movement, it was for the arts, it was for music, it was for, you know, writing, all different things. And in terms of the arts, there was this reinvention of how space is laid out. There was a freeing up of how we thought about spaces. Instead of a series of rooms connected, it was that spaces were flowing together. And there was also a reinvention of the notion of technology and using the latest technology to solve building design and building construction. Also, modernism was very expressive. There's some really beautiful and yet challenging shapes that were unconventional. They didn't look to the past, but they kind of looked to the future. It was a liberation from the past. Another thing about modernism is that it really thought about being good stewards of the environment. It thought about passive solar energies, and it thought about recycling water and all the resources. Architecture and modernism also sought to solve the problems of society, the problems of people not having good housing, clean housing, fair housing, good education, good schools, trying to heal the planet. It was a place that was meant to help people thrive. It was also meant to be very cost effective, mass-produced housing and other environments that were inexpensive. And then the principles of modernism were meant to be thought about universally across the world. It wasn't just a regional thing, it was universal. And then rebellion was tolerated, and I'm going to show you some examples of some rebels in a moment here. So the roots of modernism really started in Europe, and I'm going to come back to this building, but this is a home. This was a home designed for some people in Paris, France, and the whole thing is lifted up on these legs, these columns, and then there's this crazy roof form, roof decks on the top, and it was just this really interesting combination of rigidity and kind of poetry in the architecture. So where did it start? Well, it started in England principally with the Industrial Revolution and the idea of mass production. The steam power and electricity made it possible for quicker ways to deliver goods and quicker ways to build buildings with modules. And this is the Crystal Palace outside of London that was a World's Fair site. And it's like from the 1860s. I mean, the time of our Civil War, this building was built. It looks like it could be a contemporary building today. Glass and steel, really high vaults, just beautiful. And then steel itself could be repeatedly designed and built, but and so it was efficient and cost effective to build bridges. And then the image on the right is the Eiffel Tower. But it could also be done with lyricism and poetry and kind of an ornamental texture to the architecture. So the other big aspect of the influence of modernism was World War I. And Europe was really decimated, and in particular, Germany was destroyed, and they needed to rebuild not only their buildings, but kind of their sensibility. And the biggest influence in modernism, in my opinion, was this group of people who started a college called the Bauhaus. And it was a place where they brought together architects and interior designers and ceramicists and painters and said, let's put you all together and find a way to bring the ideas of mass production and meld it with the idea of craftsmanship and artistry. And these are two buildings that the director of the Bauhaus designed, Walter Gropius. He was in many ways the father of organizing kind of herding the cats of these teachers at this college. And the building on the right's a factory building, but the wall is just ethereal to allow light in, and it's the first sort of what you call a curtain wall, what's been called a curtain wall. It's like a sheet of glass and metal that keeps the elements out, but the structure is pulled back inside the building, so you don't see a heaviness on the outside. It's very light, and that's part of those aspects of modernism. It's a lightness and also an industrial quality of materials. The next one of the next directors of the Bauhaus was this man named Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and this was an exhibit hall that he designed for the German pavilion in Barcelona. And it's almost impossible to think about how this building could stand up. It's almost like if you took a deck of cards and held and stacked them and created this building. It's the other thing about him that he explored and other modernists is that space would flow from indoors to outside through the windows and around these planes of elegant, in this case, marble for this exhibit hall. The other thing that he was noted for was really inventing the skyscraper that you see to this very day, a very repetitive module that it was very glassy, but in his hands, it was also very playful. These building forms were shaped and curvy and angular. They weren't just a box. And in one of the fortunes of us winning World War II is that these German thinkers came to this country and practiced here, Gropius and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. So they brought their ideas to this country and influenced architecture in Boulder. This next architect was kind of the third major design master of Europe. His name was Charles Jeanneret. He called himself Le Corbusier. The diagram on the right is that house I showed you before, and on the left it's him diagramming that house, that each of those dots is a column, but then the walls could be angular or curvilinear and kind of just dance around, and there's a freeness to his thinking. And he was the most experimental of these architects. So you can see the building on the left is a pilgrimage church in France. It is spiritual. I'm not Christian, but I went there and I felt close to Jesus. It was just unbelievable in its the way light comes through and the way there was mass and there was color. And yet the building on the right is this gridded form. It is a prototype that he developed for a housing idea that was basically a village all together. It was a school in the building and offices in the building and shops in the building and residences and a variety of residences in the single building. And he designed this, and it got exported all across the world. And then just to remind you that modernism did infiltrate all aspects of design, from a Picasso who looked at a human being and abstracted it to that image on the left in an asymmetrical composition, but it's still very balanced. And the same thing with a Jacques Lipchitz sculpture. And then a Marcel Breuer chair that was based on the tubular frame of a bicycle, and even a lighter that looked like it was a locomotive screaming along. So here are those roots of modernism in Europe and a summary. And I'm going to keep going because I've got more. So how did it get to this country? Well, Chicago was kind of the main place where modernism took hold. And the biggest reason was that the fire just decimated the town in the early 1870s. And when they rebuilt, they wanted to rebuild in fire-resistant buildings. And this man, William LeBaron Jenney, who was an engineer, developed the first steel frame fireproof buildings. And so you can see a couple images of that. Now, William LeBaron Jenney was an engineer during the Civil War, and he designed bridges for General Grant and General Sherman. And he took that bridge technology and it advanced it into building design. Now, one of his employees was Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan designed this department store in Chicago, the Carson Perry Scott store, and really see a more of a modernist expression, almost no masonry. It's really an expression of the steel frame of that building. And yet inside is a kind of a forest of columns, and you can see the shop displays lining it. Now, he had an employee who worked for him, and that was Frank Lloyd Wright, who he basically fired because he was moonlighting. So Louis Sullivan kicked Frank Lloyd Wright out, and Wright went out on his own, and he designed, among some just many amazing modernist buildings, that couldn't be possible without the technology of the industrial revolution of steel and glass. And he also really pushed the limits on space and how space would flow. In this image on the bottom right, there's a fireplace hearth that anchors the room, and yet space flows around that hearth on both sides to other rooms in the building. And then, of course, probably his most famous building is the Falling Water country home outside of Pittsburgh. And it's this great combination of the European modernism kind of married with American earthiness, the stone and the connected to nature, whereas Europe kind of divorced itself from nature, Wright connected in an American way to nature. So here were those three architects. And then here are the pioneers of modernism in Boulder. And I'm going to go through each of them pretty quickly, starting with Glenn Huntington. And he was the first. His father was an architect, and Glenn Jr. came to Boulder to practice. One of the first buildings he designed was this Frank Lloyd Wright knockoff on Pine Street in 1919. And then, of course, he later on designed this sugar cube Art Deco style replacement for Boulder Courthouse, which is still, just an incredible anchor to the Pearl Street Mall. And he turned over his practice to one of his employees, and that was James Hunter. James Hunter looks a little bit like a celebrity Hollywood movie type in this image, and I love it because he was, I call him the father of modernism because he created an environment in his office that attracted really great designers. And I'll show you who they were coming up, but some of his buildings were residential buildings. I think the top right was for one of the heirs to the Samsonite family fortune. And the bottom is of course, the library, the Boulder Public Library, which has, been revered and added on to pretty lovingly over the years. This is a great picture. So on the right is an architect, one of his staff named Hobart Wagner, and he's one of those pioneers. And here they are. They're just all working elbow to elbow. They probably posed for this picture, but here's Hunter in the midst with his gang of people. He also hired the very first woman architect. I'll show you one of her designs later on, and I'm going to zoom into that image. There's like a framed painting on the top left. There it is on the left side. So that was a rendering they did of the municipal building. And then on the top right is that municipal building as it got executed. But the bottom right is a building by Le Corbusier, Charles Jeanneret. It's a building in Paris, but there's a lot of similarities. And so Boulder was in the firms like James Hunter and the people who worked for them were looking at that modern movement from Europe and from Chicago and elsewhere, and it was infiltrating our community. So here's Hobart Wagner. This was the office building that he designed for his architecture firm. Just an amazing design. It's got modernist qualities where there's a repeated module. It's over this man-made dammed up pond. It's got roof terraces. It's lightweight. It's got spaces that flow together. It's just incredible. And it's still there, but it's been remodeled so you wouldn't recognize it today. But it's still there, kind of under its renovation. This next architect is Titian Papacristo, who worked for James Hunter, and he designed many really innovative homes in the community. And one of the things that he did that was even maybe more remarkable is that he worked with Walter Orr Roberts to manage the National Center for Atmospheric Research building as it was being designed by I.M. Pei. And so he was a very strong designer himself, and he could go toe to toe with I.M. Pei, and he was very instrumental in even selecting that site for NCAR. I know something about that because I worked for Titian Papacristo when I lived in New York City, and found myself years later in Boulder and seeing all these Papacristo houses and having lots of chats with him about his time that he loved being in Boulder. There was a gentleman named Roger Easton who came out of the James Hunter office. This image on the top right was his own office space. It's now a dental office, but it's just, again, like a Mies van der Rohe style house of cards with walls that are planes of solid and planes of glass, and the roof just hovers over everything. And then an apartment building nearby on 17th Street that is complicated in its plan and has rooftop terraces that connect. It has these floating elements, so those balconies. It's just a beautiful building. And then I called this man, Charles Hartling, the genius of modernism. He never repeated himself. He was always inventing himself, reinventing himself, and just a brilliant designer. And we'll see some more of his work. So here's that group of pioneers. Now I'm going to get to this section, which is talking about, okay, here are these settings of modernism that have influenced us over the years, and educational buildings. So you've got Boulder High, which is this Art Deco style building with modernist ribbon windows, and then aspects of the building that almost feel like they're moving like a locomotive. And then you have Fairview, which is a wholly different approach to architecture. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on Fairview because it's sometimes been maligned. But if you look at these two images, the one on the left is the plan of Fairview, and the one on the right is an aerial image. And in the 70s and the late 60s, America wanted to reinvent the way education was done. And instead of having cubicle classrooms, they had pods, and they would have a pod for mathematics and a pod for social studies. And the idea was that students could accelerate their learning and not feel like they're held into a single teacher or a single place. And these hexagons, these angular forms were very popular. And in the middle is kind of the central administrative offices. And then on the right were the bigger wings of the building. So it was also complicated because it was on a hill. So as we know, the building is like a continuous ramp. And it's amazing that you could build a building like that. You couldn't today. And then that aspect of progressive education goes all the way from the past, where James Hunter designed the baseline school, to the present with Casey's recent addition, using metal panels and modernist notions of environmentalism, taking advantage of daylight. And then even at CU, from the geodesic dome of the astronomy building to the most recent aerospace headquarters, clothed in precepts of modernism from the outside to the in. Retail, I mean, you can't even go shopping in town without being in environments that were thoughtful in a modernist sensibility. The top left is the community marketplace that Hobie Wagner designed, with this impossibly thin shelled roof structure made out of concrete that's celebrated with that zigzag ribbon in the front. The Mike's camera is this amazing abstract cubist composition in a mixed use building. So it's not just retail, but it's office. That's another modernist idea, to mix the uses in a single building. It's a Hobie Wagner Fruhof's building with his pyramidal shapes that he was in love with. And then a Mies van der Rohe type building that was Meiningers and years before that, Art Hardware. Boy, do we have some cool buildings at our churches. I mean, you couldn't go to church without being in a wow structure, a wow building, like mini cathedrals with lofty spaces and really incredible shapes and forms. And I'm not going to go through all these images because I'll be running out of time. I'm not going to describe them all, but you get the sense that modernism just became a backdrop for our lives, in whether it was going to the store or going to churches. And here's some more churches in town. The one in the middle is an addition to a very traditional church, but this is a Margaret Reed addition, kind of a rocket shape that launches out of the back side of the building. And then on the right, I have to say, this building is one of my favorite Hobart Wagner designs, because it's contextual, because it relates to the angles of the original historic building, and it brings the materiality of the old sandstone into the new building, but it doesn't copy it. It expresses it in a progressive new light, which is what Boulder's about, looking to the future, looking to progress and innovations. Here's some more really cool A-frame type churches. And then even entertainment. We have, again, the Boulder Theater, Tulagis with a very cool cantilevered floating entry, and then the Nomad Theater, a Quonset hut adapted for arts. And then business. We had amazing different types of office buildings in this town, from Picasso-esque cubistic buildings on the top left to Le Corbusier style gridded structures. That was the First National Bank. And then some other, just a variety of styles, because the modernists said, let's explore, let's be poetic, let's think about different shapes, let's look to other cultures to influence our designs. And so even the bottom left, that's a Hobart Wagner design, but he was influenced by Japanese architecture in that. And yet the building seems to hover off the ground, like good modernist buildings do. And then, our own Mies van der Rohe type skyscraper. So if you take the image on the right, which is one of Mies van der Rohe's most famous buildings, the Seagram headquarters in New York City, and just look at that bottom portion of it. And then you look at the Colorado insurance headquarters building in downtown Boulder. It's a Mies building, and it's every town in America, any community that wanted to say we're a progressive town, imitated and developed that expression of a Mies style architecture. And then you had these spaceships that landed on town, pods. This was a Charles Hartling eye clinic on the top left. Those cones that come off the building are where the eye charts were. And then the building on the right is this really unique way to have windows as these towers throughout the building that bring daylight into what's a medical office building. And the sciences always worked in this modernist sensibility. The most recent addition to the Bureau of Standards, NIST, is this modernist sensibility. Below that is the NOAA building, designed by the same architecture firm that designed the Denver airport. And then on the right is I.M. Pei's design for NCAR. So science always was looking to be out in front and expressing its yearning for the future. And then even apartment buildings, these are student apartment buildings. So we all know the towers, the Williams Village towers. For better, for worse, they are actually very beautiful abstract sculptures in themselves. They've been maligned by that they were somewhat unlivable, but I think that has to do with somewhat of the social life of students and not so much the architecture. And then the top right is one of those Huntington, the first architect in town, designed this super European style with rooftop terraces made out of concrete block. And it's in Uni Hill, and it's still there today. It'll last forever. It's just a beauty. And then these are senior living house apartment buildings. The one on the right near the Boulder Library, and the one on the left is Golden West. Very international, very modernist, sun shading to take the the harsh summer sun off the windows, and just a skyscraper. And then homes. My gosh, we've got an amazing number of homes in Boulder. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but I just want to focus on this one. This room on the right is I think one of the greatest rooms in the country, modernist rooms. It has this inverted dome for the room, so you feel intimate in the room, but the walls lift up the roof along the edges, and there's this anchor of a fireplace. Here's another look inside one of these amazing houses by Charles Hartling. This is Hobart Wagner's own home, a pyramid house with a skylight at the apex, and a forest in the middle in the atrium. A couple of houses by Papacristo and Hartling, very angular, very interesting, very industrial materials, concrete block. Here's some very geometric homes, circles on the right and triangles on the left in town. So a lot of these were college professors, and they wanted to live in these buildings that express their spirit and the spirit of the university. This is one of my all-time favorite homes in town by Charles Hartling, just like a seashell that is sitting on top of these spiraling, curving forms. Just incredible. And then government, our government's always been, or since the 30s, housed in progressive architecture, modernist buildings. And even our civic discourse has been at the library in a modernist buildings and the band shell. So there are modern preservation issues in Boulder, and I want to talk about 3 of them. And we might have a hard stop at 8, but I won't stop at 8. So I'm going to try to get through these in the next 5 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. So the first one I want to talk about is one of Hobart Wagner's pyramidal designs. This was for the Midland Savings Bank. And I wanted to call out this image on the bottom right. If you see that dollar bill and the Masonic symbol of power and knowledge with this eye at the apex of the pyramid, well, that's been abstracted in this bank building. There's an eye atrium skylight at the apex of this building, and so it's a modern interpretation of that symbol of America. And the savings and loans. Here's a scene from It's a Wonderful Life. What would that town have been like without George and the savings and loans? And the savings and loans in the 60s and 70s made it possible for Boulder to grow. And it's part of our social history as well. And so that is important to know, because that building, and I'm not sure if you can see my arrow showing where that building is located, but that building is right in the heart of our civic park center. And we've been trying, and Historic Boulder's been trying to get it landmarked, and the city's been pushing it off and delaying it. And our fear is that this will happen, that some developer is going to come in and convince the city that they need to put another, building comparable to what's across the street to maximize the utility of the site. When in fact, I think the maximum utility of the site would be to repurpose that existing building as a part of that cultural center, with a Dushanbe Tea House and BMOCA and the band shell, and turn the interior into a community center that can have music and dance and expansions of maybe year-round farmers markets. So let's repurpose and get that building reused and re-landmarked. The next issue that I want to talk about is the Harvest House Hotel. And I've outlined in red the property, although originally the design included the 3 buildings to the north and the 2 buildings on the left. So it was a big master plan for a hotel and shops and apartments. And over the years, it's been added onto, and currently there's a plan to tear it all down, except for those 2 buildings on the left, and put 4 apartment buildings in this place. And while you might look at the building now and say, gosh, it's been kind of watered down and remodeled, where it doesn't feel all that important. If you look at the original building, it was this beautiful soft curving design that was derivative of the famous Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. This curving building with long lines, horizontal lines of balconies, and anchored by a swimming pool. And who hasn't grown up in Boulder and spent time at the Harvest House for swim classes or the Friday afternoon clubs or weddings or business meetings? And so there's a social history as well as an architectural history. And I would argue that you could develop the site, tear down portions of the original building, of the additions, but repurpose the original building for low-income housing, because we need to have more affordable housing. Any new development will need to provide affordable housing. Why not put it on site and reuse the original building? And the last bit of modern architecture that I want to talk about is Ball Aerospace. So you think about, this is a company from Indiana that made glass jars for people to can fruit. How did they become an aerospace place? Well, they had a family member who went off. He went off from the family. He said, I want to do this other thing. And he enlisted scientists from Boulder to go along with it. And they designed and clothed their first buildings in the most modern architecture, looking to the future. They said in that moment, we want to express ourselves as very progressive, looking to the future, talking about science, and they currently have a plan to tear that all down, with the exception in the bottom left, you can see where it says 1956. That image is this image on the right. So the current plan, and I give our planning department kudos for even getting that safeguarded. But the heart and soul of this complex is the tower, which holds the street edge. And I'm going to come back to that. So here you see an overview. There's Arapahoe Street here. You have the tower here, which is this clear, gridded, rational building that could easily be repurposed because it's a great floor plate size and it's a great structural grid system. But instead, what they want to do is, if you look at these three images, these are actually 3 phases of the plan for this development, and it doesn't even include all of it. So on the left is the plan. At the top is this gray building, gray portion, that's preserving the building, that low building with the inverted roofs. On the bottom is the tower. And then what you're not seeing is off to the top left is the major addition, 350,000 square feet that they're planning to add to their campus. The next phase is the one on the right, proposed phase 2, tear down the tower and replace it with parking lot and put a parking garage at the top of the building. So not only do they need more parking, they're building a parking garage, and they're going to tear down the tower and front Arapahoe Street with parking lot. And then third phase is to add another parking garage to their site. So, you know, the question is parking that valuable that we lose that sense? And I would argue to them that they lose their spirit, they lose their soul. Their soul is that tower. So here they are, those 3 modern preservation issues in 2021. And I'm just going to quickly flash through the buildings we've lost over time, the modernist buildings, poetically, geometrically, innovatively, that have shaped our lives over the years. And here they are, variety of types. And I just want to finish with this. Again, if we keep on tearing down our modernist legacies, we're going to devalue our environment and lose our soul. And I know a lot of people have been talking about Boulder isn't the same Boulder that we remember, but if we keep tearing down these modernist buildings, we're gonna lose that inspirational nature of Boulder. So that's the story I wanted to weave for you tonight, and I'm looking forward to having comments and questions and open the floor for people.
So thanks, Len, so much. That was wonderful. I have one question in the chat from Dan Corson, who's asking is, we all know how influential Charles Hartling was in Boulder. Did he have a national or international reputation?
Charles Hartling did not have an international reputation until he died. He did, however, get published in Life magazine and in couple architecture magazines during his lifetime. So among architects, he was known nationwide. And among readers of Life magazine, that picture that I showed of that house with that incredible room, that was the cover of Life magazine. But now there's a great website for his work, and people know his work all over the world now.
I have a small personal question. Well, I have two personal comments. So was the Hobie Wagner's office that was set in the pond?
Yes, that was his office.
Did that become Crowder's restaurant, or is that someplace else?
I don't think so. I think it's still an office building, and it's around 30th and Baseline.
I think it might be the same building.
Okay.
Anyhow, not critically important.
Yeah.
Okay. I will say I have a personal stake or a personal interest in Ball Aerospace, because the reason I live in Boulder is my dad was an early engineer working in that tower in the 60s.
Oh, did you ever go in the building then?
I've been in the building a number of times.
Yeah.
Back when it had computers where you had to unplug cords and plug them into other ports.
Yeah. Yeah.
So somebody has said that that the Hobie Wagner site is a Baseline and 29th is now called the Treehouse. That's Stephen Wallace. Thank you. And David Radisson asked us, what can we do to help preserve the modernist buildings that you've highlighted?
So I think the question, it's a great question, and I'd say the best thing to do is contact the planning department directly and contact the city council directly. That would be the first way if there's a particular building that you want to advocate for. The other thing is education, finding ways to educate people like this about modernism and why these are still important. These ideas are still relevant today. And I would certainly get in contact with Historic Boulder, because that's an organization that's here to serve us in doing the hard work for the preservation, and get in contact with the Landmarks Board in the city planning office. And those are some of the things that I think you could be doing to advocate for preservation.
So I'll certainly pitch in that I'd encourage people to contact Historic Boulder. We are actively working on preservation of the atrium building. We're working on helping the Boulder Theater with its needs for renovation. We're interested in the Harvest House and multiple other buildings. So I have a question particularly from Deborah that asked why the city is reluctant to move forward with the landmarking of the atrium.
You know, I don't have a good answer for that. And what I've heard recently, and in all fairness, what I've heard, the reason is that they've been really overwhelmed and understaffed because of COVID, and so they asked Historic Boulder to pull back on pushing for that preservation and the landmarking of that building. But you know, you never know if that's the full answer or if there's something more behind it. And so just to be out in front of them, it's just really good for us to be talking to them and saying, you know, this is important to us. And, you know, while we do understand your plight of being understaffed, you know, can't we get this to happen soon? Can't you give us a commitment on a time frame?
So of course, I couldn't agree with that more. I will just tell people who don't know this, that Historic Boulder has actually submitted a landmark application, and the application's been accepted on the atrium. So the building cannot be demolished without there being a decision made by the Landmarks Board and the City Council. And we're continuing to work on that steadily. I have a question asking whether those of us who are registered can receive the recorded version and share it. And the answer is, I'm hoping that I will be able to put this presentation up on the Historic Boulder website so that everybody who would like to see it can do so.
And I haven't given out my email address, but I'll give it to you because I would certainly welcome people to follow up with me. Although, like I said, I'd prefer that you get in contact with Historic Boulder. But if there's something that you need to reach out to me about, then my email address is thesegels@comcast.net. So it's THESEGEL@COMCAST.net. And if you didn't write that down and you want to get it later, you can just reach out to Historic Boulder.
So I don't. Let's see. Oh, but somebody has said thank you for and keep publicizing these issues to a wider audience. So that is definitely our goal. I'm not sure I introduced myself at the beginning of this meeting. So I'm Bob Buckle. I'm the Secretary of Historic Boulder. And you're welcome to reach out to the Board of Historic Boulder. My email is bob@historicboulder.org. Our co-presidents, Susan Osborne and Ruth McKaiser, are Ruth or Susan at historicboulder.org. So please feel free to contact us or other members of the board, which you can find on our website, historicboulder.org. All of these issues are very important to all of us who are board members and members of Historic Boulder. And I'd encourage everyone who came to this meeting to join us in this activism, that's both education and advocacy for all of these buildings that we care about in the community that we love, which is Boulder. Again, I'll remind people that the next 2 Wednesdays at the same time, we have presentations on different subjects. And I think it's time to probably wrap up the meeting tonight. And so I want to finish by just thanking Len again for such a great presentation. As I said at the beginning, I loved the last time I heard him speak, and this was true again tonight. And I think these are, critical issues for us to continue to work on in preservation in Boulder. So thanks everyone for coming, and hope to see you next week. Before there's a place I'm supposed to be able to close the whole meeting. I can maybe put someplace there's a end meeting.